If you ask fans today about what was the greatest period in WWE history, many will tell you that it was the Attitude Era. But there was another time which came before that, the original boom for the WWF. Hell, this was really the origin point of the company as we know it now, a sports entertainment spectacular, as so much of the rulebook that is followed today was written here. But just what made it so special? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at right now. But before we go into detail about the Golden Era, we have to first provide some context about what the wrestling industry was like prior to this. Back in the 70s and before, in North America at least, it was divided into a number of territories, with a promoter of each of these territories running it like its own kingdom. If, for example, you went down to Memphis, then it would be all about Jerry Lawler and Jerry Jarrett's Continental Wrestling Association. And if you instead went over to Dallas, then you'd find Fritz von Erich's World Class Championship Wrestling ruling the roost. Of course, that was only a tiny percentage of the major territories operating during the 60s, 70s, and early 80s. Outside of them, there were also places like Championship Wrestling from Florida, Mid-South Wrestling, Jim Crockett Promotions, the American Wrestling Association, Pacific Northwest Wrestling, Stampede Wrestling, and of course, the Worldwide Wrestling Federation. Hell, even over in Japan, you had official National Wrestling Alliance affiliates like Giant Baba's All Japan Pro Wrestling. But while every one of these had their own dedicated fan bases amongst the local populace, the WWF, or Worldwide Wrestling Federation to give it its full name, had one major advantage in that it was in the New York territory, so it was a very attractive one for many performers to head over to. Yes, one thing you could always count on if you did a spell in New York during this era was that you were going to be paid very well. And on top of that, you were also going to get the chance to work with big stars like Bruno Sammartino, Bob Backlund, and superstar Billy Graham. Even then though, the idea that WWF would ever be the only game in town back in the early 80s was unthinkable, as this was the point when all the promoters had a handshake agreement with one another not to encroach upon each other's space. In doing things that way, everyone could thrive in their own areas, and all the wrestlers would have a healthy system of different places they could look for work in. But there was one man who had a bigger vision for the industry, and that person would be none other than Vince McMahon Jr., the son of WWF's owner Vince McMahon Sr. What was Vince Jr.'s vision? Well, he saw the rise of cable television happening in the early 80s, and within this, an opportunity to take the sport national, creating one major promotion which would cover the entire country, and then later, the entire world. Basically, he wanted to create wrestling's version of the NFL. And that was something he set about doing in 1982 when, after a few years of having worked for his father, he purchased the promotion from him, with his dad making him a sweetheart deal where he would be able to pay him back over time in a series of installments, something which was easily done for the new boss as the New York territory regularly drew a lot of money, more so than most other territories out there. That said, while buying the company may have been pretty easy for Vince, going national was not going to be so simple. No, this required a lot more risk. So he made sure to get all his chess pieces in place over the next couple of years, as throughout the rest of 1982 and the entirety of 1983, the boss started investing in the future by signing away big names from other places, with some of the biggest of these being Roddy Piper, Bobby Heenan, and of course, Hulk Hogan. Yes, it would be in December of 1983 that the key player in the Golden Era which was to come would re-debut in the now renamed World Wrestling Federation after having spent a prior period there back during the turn of the decade. And almost instantly after reappearing, Hogan would be pushed to the moon as he was booked to win the WWF Championship from the Iron Sheik in January of 1984. Clearly then, the message was out there now. WWF was going hard with their push to be the top dog in wrestling, and the way they were doing this was by having the biggest and most colorful star there was, surrounded by a high-end production which would appeal to the children of America en masse. But this in itself wasn't seen as controversial by other promoters. No, making your own territory successful was what they were all trying to do after all. What was seen as heresy to them, however, was when, soon after this, McMahon started going into other territories and offering the local TV networks there extra money in order to give him the TV time they would be giving to places like Jim Crockett, Mid-South, and others instead. Hell, one of the most famous incidents of this, the one which saw Georgia Championship Wrestling's time slot suddenly turn into WWF's one out of the blue one day, would later come to be known as Black Saturday, and it would represent a huge line in the sand in the industry's history, a definitive before and after point. What those other promoters realized at this point, too late for them to do anything about it, was that Vince McMahon wasn't looking to just compete with them. No, he was looking to flat out end them, something which completely broke the code that territorial wrestling had been built upon up until then. So, needless to say, Vince McMahon Sr. was not happy about this when word got back to him about what his son was doing. But with him being in his final days by that time, there was little he could do to stop the inevitable future which was coming. A future which would reach its final form when, in early 1985, Vince Jr. made a deal with MTV to start airing special events on their network, the most important of which would be The War to Settle the Score on February 18th of that year, a show which was headlined by a match pitting Hulk Hogan against Roddy Piper for the WWF title. Did this do its job in garnering a bunch of interest from young people who had never sampled pro wrestling before? Yes, it did, as immediately it was clear The War to Settle the Score was something different to what had come before. Sure, the myth that pro wrestling had only existed in smoky bars prior to that is just that, a myth, as many territories had been able to fill out large arenas and even stadiums in the past, all while JCP had been pioneering the Wrestling Super Show with Starrcade as early as 1983. That said, what none of these companies had was the neon-soaked sheen and colorful, larger-than-life look that Vince McMahon was presenting. Basically, this was something which felt far more big-time for a decade like the 80s than whatever the likes of Bill Watts or Jerry Jarrett were doing. And the success of The War to Settle the Score would only be the beginning as it turned out, because just 1 month later on March 31st, WWF would run WrestleMania, a spectacle unlike anything the industry had ever seen before. And not just because it was helmed by Hulk Hogan, the man who was fast becoming a breakout pop culture phenomenon, but also because it drew a lot more casual eyeballs in with the addition of major celebrities like Cyndi Lauper, Muhammad Ali, Liberace, and most importantly, A-Team star Mr. T. Yes, it would be Mr. T who partnered up with the Hulkster in the main event of the show to defeat the villainous threat of Roddy Piper and Paul Orndorff, and that proved to be a great decision as it helped to turn the show into a massive success, a true moment in 80s pop culture history, as for the first time, middle-class families all across the country were talking about professional wrestling and were even going to watch it on closed-circuit screenings at local cinemas. As you would expect then, once it was over, WWF suddenly became the talk of the town as kids in particular now became obsessed with the antics of their favorite superstars. How would this impact the larger industry? Well, while most of the other territories would keep fighting, it was clear after a show like WrestleMania that they were fighting a losing battle and that the industry had now changed dramatically. And this was something a lot of the wrestlers working for these promotions realized too, which was why a number of them decided to jump ship to WWF as well here. We're talking about names like Ted DiBiase, Jake Roberts, and Junkyard Dog leaving Mid-South, the Honky Tonk Man exiting stage right from Stampede, and perhaps most importantly, Macho Man Randy Savage taking his leave from Memphis. That's right, if Hulk Hogan was the undisputed ace of the golden era, then Randy Savage was a strong number 2, with his excellent in-ring skills and fantastic larger-than-life character proving to be a huge hit with fans as soon as he arrived in WWF in the summer of 1985. That said, during those early days, he would technically be a heel, with it being his villainous antics which were brought to the forefront as he gained control of the Intercontinental title. And he'd still be in possession of that belt by the time WrestleMania 3 came around, and he had a true Matt Classic, probably the best in-ring effort of the Golden Era, against Ricky the Dragon Steamboat here. But while Savage Steamboat might have been the best wrestling match at WrestleMania 3 by a clear distance, it wasn't the bout which drew the house. No, after WrestleMania 2 had been seen as something of a disappointment following the blow-away success of the first installment, with it largely overreaching itself by trying to air live from 3 different cities at once, the third entry in the series would do something almost unparalleled by taking pro wrestling to an all-new height. How did it do this? Well, on March 29, 1987, 78,000 people would be packed into the Pontiac Silverdome in Michigan to watch the historic showdown between Hulk Hogan and Andre the Giant. Clearly then, from a spectacle standpoint, this was the high watermark of the Golden Era, as it was an achievement the company wouldn't be able to best for years thereafter, a true sign that wrestling had entered a new stratosphere in terms of mainstream acceptance. And this would lead to WWF only continuing to grow in popularity with kids, now all across the world, as following the success of Hogan Andre, the WWF merchandise machine went into overdrive, and you couldn't walk around a playground without at every turn seeing Rowdy Roddy Piper t-shirts, Randy Savage lunchboxes, Jake Roberts school bags, or kids talking about the latest episode of the Hulk Hogan's Rockin' Wrestling Saturday morning cartoon. Truly, it's impossible to overestimate just how huge WWF was back then. It became a bona fide piece of pop culture iconography, a slice of 80s Americana on the level of Back to the Future or Michael Jackson. And the promotion would continue to grow from here, as over the next few years, they added more major shows to their calendar in the form of Survivor Series, SummerSlam, and the Royal Rumble, with the latter of these becoming particularly popular on account of it being the home of the titular 30-man over-the-top Battle Royal, arguably the greatest gimmick match ever created. Hell, so popular were Vince McMahon and company here that when Andre the Giant conspired with the Million Dollar Man Ted DiBiase to screw Hulk Hogan out of the WWF title at February 5th, 1988's The Main Event on NBC, a staggering 33 million people would be watching all around America. But while this shocking moment, which was seen by so many, marked the end of Hogan's first world title run in WWF, it wouldn't leave fans without a babyface champion for long, because at WrestleMania 4, a couple of months later, a newly babyface Randy Savage would win a one-night tournament to become the new top dog in WWF. And while this could have been seen as a risky move on the face of things, taking the belt off of the face of the company, the Macho Man proved to be so over, business would remain just as strong with him as the man. So over would he be, in fact, he'd keep a hold of that belt for the next year, all while Hulk Hogan took a few months off to start his burgeoning film career with a starring role in No Holds Barred. And when he returned from his sabbatical in the summer, he'd start a program with Savage which in many ways marked the creative peak of the golden era, the saga of the Mega Powers. What made the Mega Powers angle so great? Well, it saw the undisputed top two stars in Vince McMahon's promotion partner up throughout the second half of 1988. But it wasn't all good times amongst the pair. No, as the months went on, the Macho Man started growing more and more jealous of the Hulkster as he came to believe that Hogan had lust in his eyes for his on-screen valet and real-life wife, Miss Elizabeth. And that would all reach a head in early 1989 when, in a now classic scene, the Mega Powers exploded after Savage turned heel on his partner, with this causing a one-on-one match between them to be booked for WrestleMania 5, one in which the WWF title would be on the line. As you would expect then, that match ended with Hogan regaining the WWF title, and in doing so, he solidified his spot as the ace of the era and the biggest star wrestling had ever seen at that time. Honestly, while many members of the roster were full-blown household names come the late 80s, specifically people like Jake the Snake Roberts, Macho Man Randy Savage, the Million Dollar Man Ted DiBiase, and Rowdy Roddy Piper, the Hulkster was on another level altogether, just as recognizable to many kids as Santa Claus or Mickey Mouse. That said, there was a challenger to his crown who had started rising up the ranks by this point, one who went by the name of the Ultimate Warrior. Yes, after making a quick splash in WWF following his debut in 1987, Jim Hellwig had ascended to the level of true superstardom by the close of the decade, something which was made easy for him on account of a look and physique which could basically be described as a superhero action figure come to life. So big was he by late 1989, in fact, there were questions being asked by his bosses about whether or not he was the man to take the mantle from Hulk Hogan as, by this point, the Hulkster's act was already starting to show signs of getting a little long in the tooth. So it was then that in a moment which represented another pretty big gamble, Vince McMahon decided to make the switch at WrestleMania 6 when he booked one of his biggest matches to date, a babyface versus babyface bout between the two biggest stars of the promotion. And what's more, this one would be one in which both the WWF title held by Hogan and the Intercontinental title held by Warrior would be on the line, winner take all. Of course, despite Jim Hellwig's growing popularity, most people expected the Hulkster to come out the victor here, but those people would be shocked when the show ended in Toronto that night, with the Ultimate Warrior holding both belts over his head as the new top star of the WWF. How would the other territories out there be responding to this? Well, for those who were still around by 1990, the only one that would still have any sense of strength left in them would be Jim Crockett Promotions, a company which had by then metamorphosed into World Championship Wrestling. But even WCW, the last bastion of the once mighty governing body of the industry, the National Wrestling Alliance, was nowhere near the level of popularity that the WWF was as the 90s began. And if you needed any evidence of this, you only need to look at the fact that at the turn of the decade, Dusty Rhodes, one of the pillars of JCP as both a wrestler and a booker, ended up jumping ship to WWF following a disagreement with his bosses down south. Sadly though, this popularity Vince McMahon's company was undergoing was about to hit a snag because, as the new decade got going, the first cracks in the armor of the Golden Era began to present themselves. And the first way this happened was when the new world champion turned out not to be the draw people thought he would be. No, for as over as the Ultimate Warrior had been as Intercontinental Champion, and for as much as children regularly went into excitement overdrive whenever he barreled out through the curtain, once he was given the top prize and asked to shoulder the weight of the entire company, it quickly became clear he was not going to be a suitable replacement for Hulk Hogan. And that led to the first signs of business starting to soften since the boom period had begun. How would WWF respond to this? Well, they'd play it safe and go back to the Hulkster at the next possible opportunity. Yes, after the Warrior dropped the title to Sergeant Slaughter at the 1991 Royal Rumble, Terry Bollea would be the man to take it from the heel transitional champion at WrestleMania 7. Sadly though, this caused more problems than it fixed, as the storyline heading into Mania that year would center around Vince McMahon trying to get heat from the real-life ongoing Gulf War of the time by having Slaughter play the role of a former American military hero turned heel Iraqi sympathizer. As you would expect then, this was a step too far for many fans, and it led to the Showcase of the Immortals having such poor ticket sales that year, it had to move from the Los Angeles Memorial Coliseum to the much smaller Los Angeles Memorial Sports Arena at the last minute, a pretty big blow in terms of public perception for the promotion. But that was far from the only problem they'd be undergoing here, as general sentiment on the product started to sour following the failure of the Ultimate Warrior's run on top, and the steroid trial began to loom larger and larger. But that wasn't to say there wasn't still plenty of good stuff to be found in WWF during those latter years of the Golden Era. Hell, by this point, The Undertaker had made his debut in spectacular fashion at the 1990 Survivor Series and would even become WWF Champion for the first time later in 1991. And that same year would also see another major debut, as it would be then that Ric Flair himself jumped from WCW, still in possession of the big gold belt, the one he referred to as the real world's title, and also quickly rose to the top of the promotion in short order. In fact, mere months after his debut in WWF, the Nature Boy would be winning the 1992 Royal Rumble, quite possibly the greatest Royal Rumble of all time, to become WWF Champion himself. Clearly then, this marked the start of a change in the way WWF was booking the show, as only a couple of years prior it would have been unlikely that Flair would have been given the top prize because for as great as he was, he just didn't have the superhero physique which was required to be a top guy in 80s WWF. And that change in the way Vince McMahon was booking would also be seen in the initial singles pushes of former tag team mainstays like Bret Hitman Hart and Shawn Michaels, two of the people who had helped to anchor that division back when it had been going through an excellent period during the late 80s with duos like the British Bulldogs, Demolition, the Brainbusters, the Road Warriors, and more. So with all these new happenings in the air then, it made WrestleMania 8 on April 5th of 1992 feel like something of a season finale in many ways, especially as, heading into the show, Hulk Hogan had announced that it might very well be his swan song to wrestling. That's right, the man who had been so critical in taking WWF to the successes it had reached during the 80s was now on the verge of exiting stage right. Why was he leaving here? Well, there were two main reasons, the first of which being the fact that by this point fans had started to tire of his act, so much so that they'd even cheered when he was eliminated at the Royal Rumble earlier that year. And then there was the second reason, the bigger reason, the steroid trial. Yes, as the biggest scandal in the company's history at the time became huge mainstream news and Vince McMahon faced a potential prison stay, Terry Bollea realized his involvement in the whole thing was making him too hot to handle as a performer. So for the sake of his long-term preservation, he decided it was best for him to step away for a while. And that would be the same for a lot of the larger-than-life performers in the WWF during the early 90s too, as it happened because throughout that year, the likes of the Ultimate Warrior, Rowdy Roddy Piper, Jake the Snake Roberts, Sid Justice, the British Bulldog, Sergeant Slaughter, the Legion of Doom, Greg the Hammer Valentine, and Jim the Anvil Neidhart would also disappear from TV. Hell, for these reasons then, many believe it was 1992, specifically WrestleMania 8, which officially marked the end of the Golden Era, as it was the point where, even when you take into account the fact that SummerSlam packed almost 80,000 people into Wembley Stadium later that year, business was on a definite and dramatic downswing overall. Honestly, in North America, it was the coldest the product had ever felt since Vince McMahon Jr. took over around a decade prior. But it wasn't the complete end, as well that year did see a lot of the names who would go on to become the faces of the new generation era begin to rise to the top, specifically Razor Ramon during his debut, Shawn Michaels when he became Intercontinental Champion, and Bret Hart after going all the way to the top by dethroning then WWF Champion Ric Flair. There were still some lingering dregs of the Golden Era left hanging around. And all of this would lead to a last gasp attempt from this era to revive itself in early 1993, as by the time WrestleMania 9 came around and it became clear to the boss that business was taking a downturn with his new movement of younger, more athletic stars, the older generation would need to be pushed right to the top again. And the way that happened would anger many, as, in what has since gone down as one of the more unpopular booking decisions in WWE's history, the Showcase of the Immortals this year ended not with Bret Hart standing tall over his top challenger Yokozuna, and in the process, cementing himself as the new face of the company. No, instead things would close out with a returning Hulk Hogan somehow back on top once again, as he left the Caesars Palace parking lot as the new WWF champion. Yes, while most people were ready to let go of the golden era by then, Vince McMahon obviously wasn't, as he still saw some potential. But to be fair, he must have been extra desperate to try and squeeze what was left from the 80s boom period, as over the space of 6 short years, the promotion had gone from packing out the Silverdome to barely filling up the parking lot of a casino in Las Vegas for their biggest show of the year. That said, no matter how much the boss was desperate to keep the glory years going, by the time Hulk Hogan dropped the WWF title to Yokozuna at King of the Ring later that year and then disappeared from the company for the next 9 years, it was clear there was no going home again. No, despite the company trying in vain to recreate the Hulk Hogan character with Lex Luger later in 1993, the golden era was now over, with the official end by some people's metrics coming with the full-blown coronation of Bret Hart at WrestleMania 10. And with a roster going forward which had much less star power overall, a creative direction which would be incredibly ropey, and a massively reduced level of fan interest, it meant the next few years were going to be incredibly difficult for the WWF. Hell, this was the period where they were never closer to going out of business, with it only being the rise of Stone Cold Steve Austin in late 1997 which ultimately saved them from bankruptcy. Still, even if the new generation was a low point for many fans, it was a necessary one, as there was just no way the heights of the 80s could have kept going when the world had changed so much by the early to mid-90s. Hell, even if the steroid trial hadn't come along, fans were getting tired of the antics of people like Hulk Hogan anyway, as it all felt a little passé after a decade had passed since it begun. But even if it was no longer popular by 1993 and 1994, when the golden era had been cooking, it had been so hot that it made an entire generation of kids fans for life. Really, if you're of a certain age, then this will always represent the peak of wrestling to you, as it was the first time the industry fully broached the mainstream and became a bona fide pop culture sensation, one in which even mid-card acts on the roster became household names. Was it better than the Attitude Era which came later? That's a debate people still have to this day. Of course, if you believe the golden era was WWE's high watermark, it's no doubt because of iconic moments like Hulk Hogan body slamming Andre the Giant, the Mega Powers exploding, and the debut of The Undertaker, just to name a few. Really, it was a time which will never be able to fully be replicated, as it is so tied with the decade in which it happened, a decade in which cartoon superheroes were real, and they could be seen every week taking part in gladiatorial battles of good and evil inside a WWF ring.